And you are now live.
Thank you, Aisha. Welcome everyone to this evening's FBS chat. It's been a while, but I'm so pleased that we're back. So pleased to have Carol with us from North Dakota, and my co-host Russ from Florida, Tara from Bath. So it's a really an Atlantic sort of across the Atlantic meeting. Carol, thank you so much for spending this time with us. I know you're extremely busy. I always am curious as to when you first found the solution focused approach and how it made a difference.
Great question. So I first heard about the solution focused approach back in the mid 90s when I was completing my master's degree in counseling. And unfortunately, though, it wasn't covered a lot, but at least I learned a little bit about it and it piqued my interest. But at the time, two theoretical orientations were kind of emphasized in my counseling program quite a bit back then. And that was person-centered therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. And so, between the two of them, I ended up picking CBT, even though I really appreciated Carl Rogers' core conditions and developing that therapeutic relationship and so forth. And in my master's program, I chose to do two different tracks. I did clinical mental health counseling track and also school counseling track. And I feel that even though both of those internships and my experiences, I was using a lot of CBT, which what was really interesting though, now reflecting back, is that I was actually kind of infusing a little bit more of the strength-based and some of the solution focus, or that was maybe just a natural way of my being, if you want to say, with that. And my journey towards using the solution focused approach wasn't probably the most direct, as probably many people are with that, especially back in the 90s. And in my clinical internship, I worked at an agency where I was spending quite a bit of time working with adolescents who had committed sex offenses. And the program that I was helping with actually was working with adjudicated youth who either were transitioning from inpatient facility or they had been court ordered to be in this program. And I was very fortunate to work with a wonderful woman that, as a site supervisor, who was very strength-based and really was looking at people individually, their own personal strengths, and helping build that resiliency and so forth with it. And she also integrated a lot of creative arts, which maybe later we'll talk about my interest in infusing creative arts into solution-focused approach. And that was just a really powerful experience for me because I have to say, and I've shared with my graduate students now that I work with at the university, that when I first heard about this opportunity with this internship, I wasn't quite sure that I wanted to work with this population, or I was just a little bit hesitant about doing it. But then once I was involved with it and seeing the growth and seeing the individual and so forth, became very passionate, and also recognizing too the own trauma that they had experienced and how some of this behavior might have become a little bit more normalized with it. And then when I was completing my school internship, of course, CBT was really popular, commonly used where I was at. And after I graduated, I decided to go the track of working as a school counselor. And when I was a school counselor, one of the things that took place while I was working at one of my schools was that we were going through a reaccreditation process. And one of the things we were doing during that reaccreditation process, this was back in the 90s, is that we were interested in gathering some data. And one of the things we did of using data to build some of our goals for reaccreditation was that we had our students take the Search Institute Developmental Assets Survey to find out what assets the students possessed, and then also doing a comparison of maybe middle school students versus high school students. And during that time, I also was drawn again to strength-based approaches. And when I was doing searches on this about finding more about what can we do, what can we integrate into our school to develop also an asset building school with this, I ran across work by John Murphy, Gerald Scolaire, which I think Russ, you could identify with. And that was when I started reading that, and the direct application to the schools. It was kind of one of those aha moments also. And it was finding about, okay, so I thought I was CBT, but then yet I'm also learning more about that application in the schools. And that's what I think I really needed at the time, was really to have some good examples of that. And that always really stuck with me. And I still have my original book from John Murphy, with my underline that I've continued to reference with that. And so that was really a turning point for me. And then I had decided to go on and pursue my doctorate degree. And I think that's also where I continued to build that interest, but also looking at working with people who have experienced trauma. So that was part of some of the research I had done during my doctoral program. But it was also always looking at things that help people get through trauma, maybe those past successes, those coping mechanisms with that. And so that was always something that I really was drawn towards, and finding ways of being proactive, helping people identify, like I said, coping mechanisms and past successes. And then after I graduated with my doctorate degree, right, like I think a month after I started my faculty position at North Dakota State University, I was able to attend a training that was put on by Insoo Kim Berg. And she was doing a training a couple of hours away from where I was working. And that, of course, was like, wow. I mean, that was, and I felt so fortunate to have a chance to see her training. And I think that's it. I mean, and especially too, that she, during that training, was talking about working with people who had been incarcerated and people who might not have that buy-in, that weren't your customers, if you want to say. And I thought to myself, how do we apply that to schools? And I thought, well, the reality is that oftentimes as school counselors, we get referrals from teachers or parents or guardians, and the people are not customers at the time, and they might not even see something as a problem. And I think that application that she was talking about, I'm like, okay, yeah, I get it. I'm sold with that. And then even, seeing too the difference it made by asking students, even young children, about what their goals are for counseling and to really honor and respect them. I thought, what a great way to start building the therapeutic relationship. So everything I learned about the solution-focused approach, I'm going, this is such a no-brainer, to be honest with you, in schools, working with children, adolescents. And so that was kind of it. And then it just kept moving, going forward and forward. And I kept digging in and finding more books that I was passionate about, and websites like Russ's website that I just absolutely loved. And I think when I started sharing some of my work was when Dr. Jay Trenihill from South Dakota State University, who had been very involved in the Solution Focused Brief Therapy Association, we had met each other years ago when I was a site supervisor for him for one of his interns at his college, and we kept in touch over the years. And he invited me to co-present at a conference, and that just kind of started it. I think I started to build the confidence, going like, well, maybe some people might want to hear what I have to say, and it just kind of continued on with that. So a shout out to Jay if you happen to be hearing this. And then at my first Solution Focused Brief Therapy Association conference, which was held in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which I helped Jay plan a little bit with the conference, I had a chance to have lunch. I sat next to Ronna Nelson, and she encouraged me. She said, have you ever thought about publishing or some of the work that you've done with your creative activities using solution focused approach? And I go, well, I hadn't. She said, well, why don't you try that? I encourage you to do that. And so that was kind of the start of that. So Ronna and Jay had a big influence on me too about sharing it. So, but yeah, it's, as we were saying earlier before we started recording, it's a solution focused approach, and the people that are involved with it, it's a small world. And it's a nice close knit world that we work in. So that's kind of a long answer to a short question, but that's kind of where I'm at. You can tell I'm a little bit passionate about it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Carol, I gotta tell you, we've heard this. The language is really similar. You had that aha, it's a no-brainer moment. And I think we've
Yeah.
all kind of had that same experience.
Yeah.
I've heard all of you talk about that, and I've heard you guys in previous interviews with experts say the same thing.
Yeah.
And it really, and I think about that part a lot. What is it? How is it that that all comes together? You're almost really kind of becoming in a state of flow, and you're just flowing with it because it makes so much sense.
It
I
does.
also, I got to tell you too, Carol, a lot of people want to hear what you have to say. I was one of them. I contacted you, maybe a few years ago. It's been a few years because I was looking for examples of how the approach was going beyond just individual counseling. I wanted to know how the solution focused approach in schools were an important part of classroom lessons and small groups and even parent conferences. How is it that and you were already doing that work. You had some great examples, very few. I mean, that's a unique area. What a unique contribution you have made in incorporating creative and expressionistic and play approaches to and solution focus. I mean, you get really two delivery methods: creative, expressionistic, solution focused, and now it could be CBT or other things, but you've really been able to integrate those things and expand on this idea that this is really just individual counseling, and it's not. We can incorporate this throughout everything that we do in a school, in an agency, in an organization, and elsewhere.
It is true. And what's funny too is I slip in a little bit of the solution focused approach into meetings with faculty members. Even with our school of ed, I was on our executive committee for a while when we were planning when we were having our departmental faculty meetings. And I said, what if we start with asking a positive question to get kind of that positive juices? I'm thinking about the work of Frederica Bannock when she talks about maybe let's up the dopamine a little bit, that we know when we start talking about positive things, it opens up and increases probably creativity. So I would slip that in. And I'm the only solution focused person that I work with our faculty. And so they sometimes, when they catch me doing that, you're doing that solution focused thing with that. But it's fun. But I've just seen how it works really well with it. And even asking the basic question of our best hopes about, and that paradigm shift that probably all of you have seen and talked about, where instead of tweaking the language, going hey, what if we shift from that problem solving versus let's look at solution building? Because we know, especially when I feel like working with children sometimes that are working or who have experienced a lot of challenges, and there's things that are completely out of their control. And there's things that we, that even as skilled as we might be as mental health professionals, we probably won't be able to help the child solve that. But can we find some basic solutions? And I always think about too when Sue Kimberg said, oftentimes the solution is not related to the problem. And I've found that multiple times. And so when I've served on or been on committees within our community, when we've had we have a Rethink Mental Health Committee, which is trying to develop compassionate communities, kind of based on the trauma sensitive schools model with it. With our compassionate communities in that meeting, I would challenge them and ask them, saying hey, let's think about solution building here, because we know there's going to be challenges. And I said, it's a tweak, and it's asking, what do we want to see instead? And that word, I always say the emphasis of, okay, let's look at positive goals, those toward goals. What do we want to see instead? And it's funny though that when I work with professionals in the field that weren't trained in solution focused approach, or my graduate students or others, that sometimes they slip back though into establishing negative goals. Well, I don't want to be depressed anymore. I don't want this. Okay. What do you want instead? And so I will have, a full slide going that word instead. I thought, regardless of what theoretical orientation you end up adopting, how about we start asking our clients, what do they want to see instead? And it's funny how oftentimes we focus so much on the things that they don't want in some of the traditional counseling approaches. So it goes back to that no-brainer, going that whole linguistics of just a few different words or changes can have a major impact.
And I'm quite curious to ask about, because you obviously made that, initially doing CBT and then making that and seeing elements of this solution focused in your practice already. But yeah, I'm really interested to hear that sort of transition from CBT into solution focused and what you notice that's particularly different between the approaches and how young people respond to solution focus compared to CBT.
Well, I think even, the scaling questions, like flipping the scale and asking, making the scales more positive and focusing more on the strengths versus things that they don't want in their life anymore. It was just like changing a few questions that made a difference. One of them, I have to share an example of years ago when I was working with one of my practicum students, and we were in a supervision meeting, and she was showing me a tape of an individual that she was really struggling with. And this individual would come to the counseling session and wear a baseball cap pulled down over the individual's eyes. And you really could tell by the body language that the person, there was just something about it. It was, I don't want to use the word resistant, but there was something more going on. And the responses that this individual gave were very short. They didn't seem quite as engaged. And she felt like she was spinning her wheels. And I said, what if you start asking him about some of the past successes or times when he was just things were a little bit easier, and focusing the conversation a little bit more on that. If you start that off, the conversation about, hey, I'm wondering what was better, what was going on better from the last time we met. And she thought, okay, I'll try that. And she started with that. And it was interesting that as the counseling session was going on, I'm watching him physically change. The posture, how he was responding to her. And he his body language was much more open with that. And then the following week, I think it was like maybe the sixth section that they had together. The interesting thing was, for the very first time ever, this individual didn't wear a baseball cap and was immediately ready to go. So she started the conversation again with asking about, hey, what was better, highlighting, complimenting, asking direct or indirect compliments, looking for those exceptions. And it just felt much better. And she also, too, instead of having her pre-assigned goals of what she thought the counseling session would be, she let go of her goals, and she started off, what would be most helpful for you during our time together? What would you like us to focus on today? And she engaged with that. And that's the thing, too, that for me to also let go of that control, thinking like, okay, as the expert, I should know going into a session what we should be talking about. And that, I think, is a little bit difficult sometimes for either new counselors in training or even counselors in general, is that they start to feel like, but shouldn't I know? Shouldn't I be doing this? It's almost that shouldn't I be doing this or setting the goals so that I'm prepared? And I say, you can always have a backup thing. I mean, this is where like the creative arts that I like to incorporate with this. This is kind of the just in case, the plan B if you need. But otherwise, though, trust the process. We always say trust the process because the process works. And it takes a little bit of time to do that. So I think that's where that slow shift of like myself when I started to do that. And then also having a chance, it's fun to be able to observe others doing it too. And then having them talk about it with each other. That's why I always love teaching distance and continuing education courses to our practicing counselors who are out there, because they've been out in the field for a while, but then those who have started to use it or who have attended a past training and using it, they can share the stories, the success stories, and they can build on that. Yeah.
Carol, you said that so well. You said it so well. The idea of, how did it click for you? How did it become a no-brainer, which it was also true for me as well. And then others, and sometimes students that we try to teach this to, kind of struggle with it, and it's not that same experience. But what you said, I think, really explained it really well, which is you got to trust the process. You got to trust that the student or the person you're working with wants to do better. And And it's sometimes counterintuitive. How can we move towards strengths, resources, opportunities, and goals without ever spending a whole lot of time on problems and issues and deficits? I mean, we've been doing that. The medical model, first you got to know it before you can deal with it for so many years. And maybe that's the part that you don't have to know. And that's the counterintuitive part that some people are having trouble letting go of.
Yeah. One of the videos that I love showing my students is the video. It's an interview of Insoo Kimberg that was done by Arnold Hubert. And where Insoo had said, you don't need to know the client's problem to help them find the solution. And some of the students are going, what? Are you kidding me? And I remember doing like a live demonstration one time with them and saying like, hey, would anyone be willing just to have fun with me? And it doesn't have to be something you're working on, but let's just kind of demonstrate how we can do this, about how with some really carefully worded questions that asking this, I'm just the facilitator. I'm not the expert of your life. But the one great thing with solution-focused approach is that it has provided us with a lot of great questions that we can put in our toolbox. And so kind of going through that, and they're going like, oh, okay, now I get it. And I said, here's the thing too, why this works so well is that when you think about working with someone who's experienced trauma, especially something that for some people is really hard to talk about, or maybe there is shame tied to it. I think when that emotion of shame can really be powerful. I said, when you don't have to drag some of these really negative emotions up, that might engage the client or the student in it a lot more too, because it's not as painful to do it. They don't have to experience this, but you can still do a lot of the work. And I know, I have to say that my students, some of them are a little bit hesitant about thinking, can the solution-focused approach really work with people who have experienced trauma or who have serious mental health diagnoses? I go, it can, it does. I think it's Joel Simon's, there's an article that he'd written about working with a client with schizophrenia. And there is the whole dialogue, kind of parts of the session in there. And I role play that with students. We kind of take roles and I say, look at the difference of the conversation that it has, even with someone with as serious of a diagnosis as schizophrenia. But it takes time with a buy-in because, when I think about it, me being the only solution-focused faculty member here, they're getting a lot of different messages from all over the place. And I don't want them to, feel pressured to do it the solution-focused way, but I'm also a little bit outnumbered too. And I have to say too, like as a master's student, when I first heard about postmodern, approaches like solution-focused, some of it was a little bit over my head, or I'm going at the time in some ways because I'm like, how could something it's kind of simple be so powerful? But it's one of those things too we talk about. Even though the concepts are simple, it's not necessarily easy to do right away because we're trying to overcome some of those negative biases that we might have, and it just feels a little bit different. But once you can overcome that, it's really fun to see the students go like, wow, I get it now.
Yeah. I love those questions. Does the model work with this, and does the model work with that? And of course, they throw
it
all
works
those
with
labels.
everything.
Well,
I was just going to say. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, I'll finish up. I was going to say that one of my favorite expressions and my response to what you're saying is that, people who suffer from schizophrenia, some days they're more schizophrenic than others. And so just focusing on the exceptions and the fluctuations is really opens things up, doesn't it? And I have another question, but Tiara, go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead, please.
No, it's fine. No, I was just going to say, I love your story, Carol, about, noticing the body language, what we see in people when we ask these questions or when we invite them to notice their strengths and capabilities.
Right.
And I think particularly in school environments, what I notice with young people, and particularly as they've worked with other therapists as well, or with social workers, and they've had to tell their story so many times, or there's an expectation that they got to tell their story again to somebody else, and it's, they're kind of ready, right? Okay.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I think that is just, I was just going to say, I think that is something that's so powerful and liberating and amazing that actually we don't need to know, what are your hopes from this conversation? And then you're inviting how they've coped and managed. And I just think that is particularly for children and young people, or for adults that have had enduring, difficulties in their lives, and had to have conversations with lots of professionals, not to have to do that. And because we create such a beautiful balance of power, there's such an equity in the relationship. And I think that opens up such greater possibility for change and for them to move forward.
Right. Well, and one of the things too, to kind of build on what you were saying, is that, I share with people about when you're working with someone who has experienced trauma, or really anyone, even though oftentimes we talk about like that intro when we ask them about their best hopes, or maybe if they want to share a little bit about what brings them to counseling, is that I emphasize that for some people, they don't need to share a lot. Other people are going to need to share a lot. And I said, you have to be in tune to the person about, do they feel that they need to share more with you, and be okay with that. Because it's also too that asking someone, what do you need from me? I mean, I find this too with family or friends, that I sometimes ask, what do you need from me? Do you just need a listening ear to vent? And so for some people, that's what they need. They need someone safe to do that. On the flip side too, that so you have to be listening to that and pick that up. But also too, one of the questions that I also like to bring up when I do trainings or teaching is that a question I like to ask, like if you're working with someone and you have a sense that it's maybe it's a traumatic event or something, but you might want to know a little bit more about that. Maybe that might help formulate this. Is asking the question, would it be okay if I asked you about this, whatever it is. So you're asking a question about asking a question, would it be okay? And that really came about by having a conversation with someone whose daughter had gone to multiple counselors or therapists, didn't connect with them, and just really resisted. And this is someone, she had experienced a lot of trauma growing up. There was a lot of abuse within the family. But one day, though, she finally met a counselor that she connected with, and her mom, asking a great solution-focused question, was, what was different about this counselor? What helped you connect with her? What was different? And I love this, and the student, or the young woman, just said, the counselor asked, would it be okay if I asked you about this? And she said they didn't feel like they had an automatic right to know some of my personal history. And that has always stuck with me. And I said, I feel it's a very respectful way of being respectfully curious by asking that question, would it be okay if I asked you about this? Yeah. So,
yeah. Choice.
I was just going to ask, I guess it's a question for all of us to think about. Carol, you were saying that some of your first cohorts of young people were, sex offenders, or maybe had been accused of that, and they were mandated to come and see you, right? They didn't go there willingly. They didn't skip and dance to it. And also you were saying about the school counsellors, where it was a parent that insisted, or a teacher that insisted. It wasn't the student themselves. What is it about this approach in particular that turns those sort of those young people into customers rather than complainants or visitors? Do you know what I mean? What is it? What's different about it?
Yeah, I think part of it is encouraging them to set the goals, and also I think acknowledging and validating and normalizing, hey, I realize that you don't want to see me, or like you might not be thrilled about doing this. Okay, so you just acknowledge it, you say what it is. However, though, the reality is your teacher or your parent guardian wants to see or wants to meet with you. So I want to, I'm hoping to put this person a little bit more in control. So either I take one or two approaches. One, what do you think they are hoping to see? And what do you think is like the smallest bit of change they're hoping to see that might say, hey, meeting with, what Carol worked, or I'm happy to see that improvement. So sometimes it's like really going like, and I might, to be honest with you, when it's appropriate, I want to say when it's appropriate, I might bring in a little bit of humor. And I say, okay, what's the bare minimum? And we're talking bare minimum that it would take so that you don't have to come and see me. And then, but also talking about, I realize that, let's say it's an adolescent, there's a lot of things that you're going through right now. And I'm wondering, while we have to meet anyway, is there something that you would like to work with me on this, and kind of having it set their goal? And I think that's the big thing too, that if you can get them, hook them in a little bit, saying like, this is your time right now. I mean, we're meeting, that's what your mom or your teacher wants to do, but this is really your time with just one-on-one with me. What would you want to use our time? So that you could say, hey, it was a little bit useful with it. And for the most part, when I was a school counselor too, it wasn't really as difficult for that, because I think too that this is kind of going back to when we talk about like comprehensive developmental school counseling programs, like being visible to all students. I worked in small schools, and so I was very visible with this, and I always wanted to start to create relationships when there wasn't a problem, being proactive about that. So, and I was, involved with either student council or National Honor Society, so I normalized interactions with me. So, and I always stressed when I went in the classroom about mutual respect, because I always felt like you don't have to earn my respect, but I'm hoping that you will do things to maintain it, and here's what you can expect from me. So, so I think subtle things like that, but then also to that hook about, before I start talking about even the issue of how do we start building that rapid rapport, with that, about simple things. So back in the day, I love music. I love different activities. I would find some type of a hook, to start talking about it. And my students knew I loved music. I listened to a lot of their same music. So, just kind of bringing that up, and hopefully developing that in a positive way that they feel a little bit more relaxed and comfortable, and know that I'm not there to lecture them. I'm there like, what are your goals? How do you reach it? And that's where, I go back to the John Murphy book. I think using solution-focused approach in middle school and high schools, he has this one dialogue of what a traditional counselor might say and what a solution-focused counselor might say. So instead of, let's say, a student's failing, their grades are failing, or they have failing grades, and instead of lecturing them, if you fail this or do that, you're not going to graduate, kind of that lecturing, versus flipping it to what does the student want? Instead of thinking like, oh, the student better get A's or B's, what do they want? And if the student says, I want to just graduate, and I want to go and I want to be a carpenter. Okay, great. So you want to graduate. What do you think that needs to take? And when were you successful at having those conversations? I think that changes it. And that, like I said, John Murphy's book is one of them too, that those conversations that always really stuck with me about flipping the script a little bit, instead of lecturing the student that they probably already know they're going to fail this class if they do this, focusing on what do they want.
Carol, you in just the last few minutes, you've mentioned role playing, you've mentioned music, and that's one of the things I'm really aware of, just the wonderful kinds of creative and expressionistic activities that you've done and developed and taught, and including puppets and time machines and magic wands and genie lamps. And in fact, you wrote an article on using a timeline activity as well. I wonder, out of all of those, which one stands out for you? Which one has really been effective and fun to do? And which one's your favorite?
Oh my gosh. There's a lot of them. So the timeline one is really easy because it's just a line that you can use. And that was, I have to also preface this too with the activities that I include with trainings, is that it's being pulled from all over the place, and then I tweak it and adapt it. So, I think about Matthew Seligman's work and Insoo Kimberg and Teresa Steiner, their work too, of pulling that in, Pam King's. I mean, the timeline was really simple. One of them too, that an activity that I'd done, and this was so non-solution focused or counseling related, but using optical science, the sciences in counseling. And so this is one of the articles that I'd written, is using optical science. I wish I had it with it. But it's based on a lesson plan for NASA. And part of it was, I was trying to engage students into a certain process. And I've had some students, and some of my interns have had students that were really interested in NASA. And so what it is, it's using like a red filter, and you can do, it's a hidden message activity. And so you use different highlighters with it. So the hidden message is actually written in green ink. And then you can use green or blue. And with it, and then you can fill it up with red and pinks and yellows and all this. But part of it is that when you put the red filter folder over it, certain light doesn't transmit through. So you can see the message that's left over that's written in green with it. And it's fun. You can do dots with it and lines. You can cover around with it. So that was just kind of fun because it was so not counseling related. But I like to bring in the sciences with it. And the other, another activity that I love to do is teaching people about neuroscience. And because we know, like, one of the curriculums that we use in my area is Second Step. And so elementary kids are learning about the basics of neuroscience. And also the movie Inside Out was teaching the kids basics for this. So I teach them, I use a can of pop, a Coke, I like Coke, and teach them about amygdala hijacking and prefrontal cortex. And it's kind of a long list. I'm actually I'm working on a manuscript on that just to kind of talk about it. But I use it in trainings a lot too, because it's multisensory, and you get people to stand and interact with one another. And so we found that works really well. And I use it in trainings even for educators, because I think about, like, if you actually have a can of pop here. I don't drink pop anymore, but I actually asked my dad if I can use this. But it's kind of like using it, like if this is the amygdala and you have different things during the day that are shaking you up. A lot of times what happens, like I've seen in the schools, where a kid is really shook up, if this is their amygdala, and we ask them questions, why did you do that? The why questions with it. And so they want them to open up, but what happens after you shake this up and you want them to open up? They're going to explode, and it's out of control. Their amygdala has taken over their prefrontal cortex. But what can we do instead, like, to bring this down? And so that's also too, like, the activities. I love doing stuff that helps kids learn about self-regulation and taking it down. So this was all shook up. But if I was asking, okay, let's think about some activities that help you calm down and regulate. If we think about calm down, and then every time the student does it, you ping this, and you just continue to go around and around, and it's a group activity with us. Eventually, like, in time, I go, okay, what do you think now? Do we have a lot of coping mechanisms that we have that can help us calm down? And then you can open this up and pour it out with that. And that's based on science.
I love it.
And it's Boyle's law, because I don't know, like, in the United States, probably the rest of you've seen this, but I don't know in the UK. Have any of you seen if you have something shook up and people hit the top?
Yeah.
Nothing. It doesn't do anything. But Boyle's law says that you're trying to break up all of the bubbles on the sides. It's the sides where you need to break it up. So by doing this, that's how you're doing it. And so we know about that inverse relationship. So it's bringing in the science of it too. So that to me is sometimes fun because it's novel, because we know that the brain likes novelty. And so, and I bring this in a little bit because of Dr. Ed Jacobs from West Virginia. He developed impact therapy, and he's about props. So I've attended his trainings. So I'm always thinking about in my brain, how do we change, what can we do to bring this in? So it's a constant thing, because when I work with students, we're constantly coming up with new things with this. One of my students is had done last year a gaming group with Dungeons and Dragons. And she's now looking at an infusing solution-focused approach into Dungeons and Dragons gaming group about helping people build strengths. So yeah, it's kind of endless. This is just how my brain works. So
I love it. Yeah, I love what you're.
I think you've
I was
stumbled
just.
onto a potential sponsor.
yes.
Yeah, it's such a brilliant idea, and I love that I feel very passionately about sharing the neuroscience, because I was doing some sessions with some year 12s here in the UK, which is beginning of sort of A levels, sort of 16, and starting to talk. Well, then in the school, sort of in the secondary school, in primary school and in secondary school, we're not talking an awful lot about the neuroscience of the adolescent brain. So we're having conversations with 16, 17-year-olds, and they're hearing it for the first time. And, it's kind of like, what difference does this make to you? If this was to be useful, what I've shared with you, what difference does it make to you? Not alone, that this is normal, and I think sharing that information about the neuroscience and adolescent brain younger is just so important. And those, I would love to use that. The Coke can is just such a brilliant prop. Brilliant.
Well, one of my master's students, well, she graduated and now she's in our PhD program, and she likes to do a build a brain. And so hers is even more complex with different things, and she stations people around. So the educators love that, and they're going like, "Oh, this is great! I need to bring this back." And the fun thing is, I know she got she presented it last year at our state conference, and after that, she ended up being asked to do presentations and was getting paid for it. She's going like, "They're going to pay me to present on this." I go, "Hey, it's new stuff." And she has 2 masters, and one of her master's degrees in drama therapy. And so it is so fun to like bounce ideas off from her with it, because she's bringing in a little bit different take on it. And people have just been they just embrace it, that movement, something a little bit different. And the kids, like I said, kids love it, but I found too that adults love it. I've told my students before, I said, if you can be a really effective counselor for children and adolescents, it's going to help you be that much more effective as working with adults. And I said that too often we separate out what we do with children versus adults, but we know that a lot of adults emotionally, especially if there's been a traumatic event, sometimes I think emotionally get stuck at some of those points in their lives. But if you bring in the creative arts with it and the solution-focused approach, I think it can be really powerful for it, and the sessions can be really effective. Yeah.
I'm just gonna, if you guys don't mind, I'm just gonna bring in a question from Gil from Ohio. Will you say more about how you use a SF solution-focused approach with non-solution-focused co-workers?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is asking even the questions about what are our best hopes, like starting meetings about if I'm helping facilitate something, asking them about the best hopes. And then also asking to reflect near the beginning when we talk about past successes, like what have we done over this past year, or even coping strategies, things like that. I think have helped a lot just with changing the tone of the conversation with it. So and then ask, one of them too, the exceptions question. I mean, with that, I think has always been really helpful about asking, can you think of a time when that student was a little bit more successful? Or can you think of a time when things were going a little bit smoother with it? So I think bringing in the basics with it, of asking those, and then setting positive goals, with that. I mean, there's just, I always talk about how the solution-focused approach can be used in so many, whether it's throughout the school or in other businesses. I say this is why it can be used in medicine and business and other areas, is because it's a way of communication that we're tweaking how we're saying it, but just changing a few words, like being much more that presuppositional language of when this happens versus if this happens, and building hope. That's another thing too, that I think whether you're in a clinical setting or you're working with peers and others, about what can we do to build hope? And so with all of my students, I always talk about Snyder's hope theory. And I said how Snyder's hope theory just really meshes well with solution focused approach, because we're already setting the goal which is the object of hope. But then on top of it, we're looking at building that agency thinking and pathways. Well, the agency thinking is past successes, bringing that up again so that people can start to say, hey, I actually have maybe a little bit more skill or talent to do this. And then the pathways about looking at what has worked for you before in the past, building that, bringing it to that level of awareness. And so that's another thing too, that when I work with people, is about how do we build hope with it. So expanding pathways and building agency with that, I think that can be really powerful with it. Yeah.
Carol, you mentioned the solution-focused approach in education, which I think of everybody, principals, teachers, and even media specialists, nurses, everybody. There's so many people in education. There have been, in fact, in Texas, there's a good example of some solution-focused schools where all the personnel, everybody involved in the school has been trained.
Right.
When you think of the solution-focused teacher, for example, what's one or two things that I notice about that person that lets me know that she's solution-focused?
Oh, that's a great question with it.
Could be classroom management or interacting with kids.
Well, because I think about the WOW program and how with the solution, with that, with the WOW program, about what they can do. I think about some of the ways of involving the students about setting goals for the classroom, and also it kind of goes back to also recognizing when students are on point and helping them facilitate like when things are going well and looking at that. And maybe goal setting a little bit with it. But it's one of those people that really also involves the students in the classroom about helping build and set the climate of the classroom. That's one thing that I notice in there, is that they're taking the time to do that. Now, one could attribute that to other different types of approaches by recognizing that. But I think they're also very intentional about that and setting the goal. And I've seen, this wasn't, in a sense, kind of solution focused, but I remember being in one elementary school when I was doing a site visit at an elementary school for one of my school interns, and I was in a classroom, and they had in the classroom they had a Yakimeter. I think that's what it's called. It's almost like a stop sign, but it measures the volume of noise in a classroom. And the teacher would ask the students, what's our goal today about the levels? What are we going to maintain for the level in our classroom with it? And she had the scaling, kind of 1, 2, 3 in a sense, and was keeping track of that. And it was kind of a fun way. And the students also would monitor each other too. So they were engaged. They had the buy-in because the students set the goal. Because we always know that people are probably more engaged in goals that they help set. So that was kind of a fun way at an elementary level.
I love that. Yeah. Calling a decibel meter a yak level meter. I love that.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. Yep. And by the way, for people that might be watching, you mentioned the WOW program. That's something Insoo Kim Berg was really started out. It's WOWW, working on what works. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I think it's so underutilized. What a great program. And I think that was probably just getting some traction before she passed away. And you reminded me, I sometimes think that would be something we need to continue and work on some more, the WOW program. Fantastic.
Yeah. Well, and I know one of the things I do when I do site visits for my school counseling interns, my goal is to always try to provide positive feedback to the students after my students have the guidance lesson, things I've observed with it. And it's always kind of fun. And I thank them for being respectful and being good listeners and talking about things like that. But then I also, though, try to make a point of, if possible, I go into the office and I asked if I can talk to the principal. And I remember one time I did this at an elementary school that was pretty high needs, that I was kind of warned, this might be a little bit more challenging. And my intern was a little bit nervous, going like, yeah, this is a pretty tough class. They were awesome, by the way. And I thought, I have to make a point after I've had giving compliments to the student of mentioning this to the principal. So when I went to the secretary, I asked, is your principal available? I was wondering, I just had something that briefly I want to share with him. I think she was a little bit, oh no, what do they do? What do the kids do? And so when I asked him to, I think he was a little bit nervous too. And I said, hey, I just want to, one, thank you for allowing your school counselor to work with my intern. But two, I just want to compliment you on your students that I observed in the class, in so-and-so's class today, and just shared a little bit of that. And it just was really fun to do that. And I think he was a little bit taken aback, but it's always bringing that. And then I had later asked my intern when we had supervision the next time, I said, how did they respond afterwards? She said they were sitting a little bit taller and they were kind of going like, oh, so this person from NDSU, like they were surprised, but they really liked it. And I think it just kind of built in once again, that when we highlight that, like if we spend more time focusing on what we want to see, we'll probably get more of it.
Yeah, I think what you're really saying so well is that this is not, I love the model because it does have a lot of concrete techniques, but one of the most important parts is what you're talking about, which is the mindset. It's the teacher or principal that goes into the classroom with their solution-focused ears and eyes on, looking for exceptions and looking for strengths rather than kind of waiting to react to when things go wrong.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And Carol, I know that you've got a particular interest in trauma-sensitive schools, and I really love the language around that. And so I'm really curious to ask about, the use of solution-focused approach within schools. What difference does that make, and how does that enable a school to become even more trauma sensitive?
I think it makes a big difference on it. I think it also becomes easier to become more trauma sensitive when you are using a solution focused lens, to be honest with you, if you're adopting it, because it just is a natural fit between the two of them. And it is, when you're doing the solution focused approach, when you show others about whether it's in the classroom or individual or group counseling or teacher consultation. Russ, I use one of your videos in my classes about showing, students about having those interactions with it. It just isn't, it makes it a lot easier to integrate that because it's just it's that toolbox you have. Oh, this is a great question. I think about this summer when I was working with school counselors and they were also trying to use solution focused approach with like MTSS, like multi-tier support system meetings and others about, they started to say, wow, like if we start to look for these positive exceptions, if we start to do this, it changes the tone of the meetings. We have more buy-in and people feel a little bit more invested because of the fact that we're focusing on different things with it. And I don't know if I'm quite answering your question well, but it's almost like we don't have to try as hard because it just is, it almost naturally happens because it's a way of connecting with people and helping them identify resources. And I really like the fact too that the solution focused approach is so culturally sensitive, is that we, by engaging the students or their family members in the conversations about looking for exceptions, helping them identify past successes, is that it also is helping them build hope, build their coping strategies, all that. So it's that language of what do we want to see instead? And I think about Sue Young's work in the UK when she said, why are we focusing on, like, for example, bully prevention? Why aren't we focusing instead on what we want? And why aren't we focusing on building positive school climate? And so that's been a big thing too, that we really have been emphasizing that a lot. And even it goes to like bully prevention or even suicide prevention, that I know one of the schools in my area that have had a series of deaths, like 1 year they had about 5 student deaths in this school. And that was pretty significant in that school. And they, fortunately, instead of immediately reacting, going, we have to have these speakers on suicide, we have to do this, that, they said, let's take a step back a little bit and let's build the positive school climate, build their resources, help them develop those areas instead of just talking about strictly prevention. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have prevention programs, but we need to have promotion. Like what do we want to promote? Yeah.
Yeah. I think like you're saying about that kind of climate, it's because it's sometimes the smallest of interactions, isn't it? It's if the kind of, the head teacher is on the gate and I'm thinking of one particular school that I work at, and, the boys are turning up, and it's kind of having a conversation around noticing you've got your tie on today, or your shirt's tucked in, rather than always that deficit. Why are you late? Why haven't you done this? Why haven't you done that? The tiny interactions that can make a difference when we notice the small things. And it's those little moments that, can be contagious and create that culture and that climate. Can make such a difference. You don't know what that child's been through the night before. It's greeting them with a smile and noticing something that's more useful and positive about them that's going to have a huge difference.
Well, and I think, Tara, you also just made me think about something too, about that idea about being respectfully curious, and that we try to train, like in the trauma sensitive schools, instead of making assumptions about and saying, like, why didn't you go to school? Why didn't ask instead what happened, or tell me more. You must have a really good reason for being late or missing school. And if you do it in a respectful manner, you might find out that the reason why they're missing school is either one, there wasn't childcare at home, or maybe there's serious bullying going on, something like that. But by changing that question, like, why did you do that versus what? Like, what was happening? How were you feeling? Whatever. Steering away from that. So I have to apologize to you. You might be hearing some construction noise. We moved into a new building, and they're finishing up our clinic here for that. So hopefully it's not too loud. But no, I think that's part of it. Is some of those solution-focused questions, like I said, like if you have like 5 good solution-focused questions, you can totally, I feel, change the direction and the tone of a conversation. And it works really well in multiple areas within a school or in a clinical setting.
Well, I'm sensitive to our time. I know we've only got a few minutes. I wonder, there's so many wonderful stories, case stories, working with kids or parents, guardians. I wonder what one of your favorite, turnaround stories is with especially a student or their family or an immigrant or refugee student. That's one of the areas that you focus on.
Yeah, I was just going to say that as well. Yeah.
Turnaround story. I think part of it, and I'll keep it maybe a little bit more general with this, is when I think about one of my students who was a refugee student, is really keeping that mindset of, instead of kind of going to lecture, going, this is due on this date, this is due, you're not going to pass with this, is asking, just kind of sitting down and taking the time, taking a breath and saying, like, hey, what's been going on? I know that you probably have a good reason. Tell me more about this, so, what are your hopes for this? I think that's part of it, is that building that relationship for it. It really goes back to not making the assumptions with it. And so I think, like, kind of keeping it a little bit broad with that, is that using a question like that, it really invited them to open up with it, because I've had students that in their cultures, seeking out counseling or any of that type of work just is not congruent, and they hold things pretty close to their heart with that. And so that's where kind of opening that up a little bit, but then also, what are your goals, asking what their goals are, what would they like to see with that, has been really powerful with that. And so I have, like, when I share this story, I have a student in mind, but that was kind of part of it, is that really, what are their goals? What are they hoping to do? Inviting them versus me lecturing, and then really opening up, like, hey, you must have a really good reason for this. And the good thing out of that, what happened was, once they kind of shared what was going on, we were then able to connect them with some resources, what they needed to help them be successful. So that's a pretty short one, but that's kind of one that really, and I think the thing is, some of those small things can make a big difference in helping build that relationship. Yeah. Yeah.
I was I was thinking about a family, because our role is working with families. So when we have an individual and it's about past trauma, maybe, or trying to kind of move forward from that. It's when you have that dynamic of a family where one feels the other needs to apologize for something, unless, because if that doesn't happen, you can't drag me forward because I ain't going there. And it's like, I kind of said, I explained the way we were working, and I said, is there anything that's happened that you feel is going to stop you in this forward direction that we need to talk about now? And I don't know why I asked it. It was the first time I'd ever asked it, but I was thinking, it doesn't sound very solution focused, but in a way, it's like some people just don't feel ready to make that next step, and how we kind of work with that, especially with a lot of trauma, I guess. Someone needs to be held responsible. Otherwise, there's a pain that I can't let go of. Do you know what I mean? How do we that's kind of the question that sort of came up in my head, and I don't know why. I've never asked that before. It just felt right at the time. Do you ever feel in a session that something's just like, I don't know, it wasn't scripted, it just came out because that's where it was going.
Yeah, yeah. I definitely feel it. So, yeah. Oh. I'm sorry, Asha.
No, I was just saying, as long as it was a useful question at that time, does it
Well,
matter?
no.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think that's the beauty of it. And I think one of the things too that I hope that in our solution focused community that we continue to do that when we have a new question that comes up, if we'll share it with others, with that and going like, I didn't really think this was quite solution focused, and yet it actually fit really well in that conversation for it. Because I think of like people who are beginning to learn how to use the solution focused approach. Sometimes it's really helpful. They like that mental image of that toolbox and to have the visuals. And that's where, Russ, I have to say, like, your handouts that you provide for free on your website are awesome. And I always direct them to your website to find that. And it's visually where it's really easy. You can scan it. I talk about how in the schools, oftentimes, if we want people to use our information, we almost have to do bullet points or make it so that you can scan it quickly and so that they're not overwhelmed with the information. And I think that's a great thing with the solution focused approach, because it is, a lot of the questions there, it's worded, straightforward. It only takes a few questions to start doing that and build your confidence, and then you can infuse more. I know in practicum, we oftentimes will have students use Frederica Bannock's 1001 solution focused questions, and they oftentimes get really overwhelmed with, at first they're going, oh my gosh, I said, find 5 initially that you're going to, that you want to use. Because I said, trust me, once you start using that, you might pick some more up with it. But yeah, I love all of her books and questions. We use that for integrating that into other games and other activities too. So I really appreciate her work.
Okay, well, we have come to the end. That was a very quick hour, and I'm sure this could go on.
That was a very quick hour. Yeah.
Very quick hour. So we will close with final comments from all of you, and we'll start with Tara. Maybe any final comments that you'd like to make, and we'll move on to everybody else.
Well, I think we could have continued to talk for another hour quite easily. Got lots of other questions, and I would have loved to hear a little bit more about information around what you've written around using the solution-focused approach with immigrants and refugee students. So maybe you need to do another chat just to talk about that. But yeah, so many highlights, and the Coke can, I'm just like, I love it. I just, and so much of what you said has really resonated with me, and perfectly timed at the beginning of the school year, like of just like brimming with solution focused passion, even more than usual. So thank you, Carol.
Yeah, Carol, I got to tell you, I really appreciate so many things about you. 3 come to mind for me. One is the creative expressionistic activities that you really developed around the solution focused model. I mean, we can't have enough of that. The other thing is applying the model to special situations, whether it's immigrant, refugee, student, suicide, trauma. That is tremendous. And then also kind of, this is where we're at, I think, in this approach in education, really helping others benefit from this approach, all educators, not just counselors. So thank you for all of that work. And I'll look forward to seeing what else you're going to do.
Thank you.
Well, this has been a joy because it's been really easy for me. You three have been amazing. Especially because Carol, when I was a school mentor, not a counsellor, but we were mentors back then, I always got the angry kids and I always used to try to explain what was going on in their bodies. So they knew why their hands were shaking or their legs were tapping. And like you were saying, I used to say that your emotional brain has hijacked your thinking brain. It's gone offline for a bit. This is why you need to take a break. And they kind of got it. So that really... that Coke can, if I'd known that would have been brilliant as well, like Tara was saying. But yeah, it's been, it's again, just a lovely conversation. These always make me know that I can't go back to any other way of working. And this is just, again, highlighted that. So thank you. Thank all three of you. It's been brilliant. Thank you.
This was fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we will hopefully be asking Carol back to discuss immigrant and refugee students, because that is a topic on its own. And I'm sure that many people will be interested in that. But from us at FBS Chat and everybody here, we wish you a good evening, a good night, good morning, wherever you are in the world, good afternoon, and join us for the next FBS Chat. If I could ask you guys to just stay there, and everyone else, goodbye.